In your book, Conscious, you described evidence that free will is an illusion and that consciousness is used to construct this illusion and convince ourselves that we are in fact deciding our actions. Can you explain this? I think this is chapter 3.
First of all, I really think it's important to make a distinction between free will and conscious will, and we'll get into that in a moment. So free will in terms of our brain as a system in nature, making complex decisions and doing all of the complex processing it does, there is a decision-making process in nature that our brains undergo that we can call free will. That's fine to use that shorthand for that. Although once we get into the details, I might convince you that it's not so free, but that the decision-making process is a process in nature. The feeling, our conscious experience of feeling like consciousness is the thing that is driving the behavior. That is, I would say, in most cases, an illusion. And usually when we talk about free will, that's the thing we're talking about. I mean, sometimes it's in conjunction with the decision-making process, but for the most part, when we use the term free will, we're talking about this feeling that consciousness, that we have a self, that there's this concrete thing that's separate from brain processing that somehow swoops in and is the cause of our decision or the cause of our next action. And that is, in large part, if not in its entirety, an illusion.
So conscious will is an illusion, and then we can try to
Free will, I would say, is good shorthand for a process in nature, which is a decision-making process of the brain.
But decisions are still being made. So there's if you ran the universe over again, would it turn out the same way? I mean, maybe I'm trying to sneak up to like, what does it mean to make a decision in a way that's almost that means something?
So this is where our intuitions get challenged. I've been thinking about some new examples for this just because I talk about it a lot. And the truth is, most of the things I write about and talk about and think about are so counterintuitive. I mean, that's really what my game is breaking intuitions, shaking up intuitions in order to get a deeper understanding of reality. I'm often, even though I've thought about this for 20 years and think about it all the time, it's an obsession of mine, really. I have to get back into that mind frame to be able to think clearly about it because it is so counterintuitive.
How long does that take? How hard is that?
Depends on if there are kids around or if I'm alone or if I've been meditating. But what I was going to say, actually, I felt like we needed to just take one step back and talk a little bit, just because I think the importance of shaking up intuitions for scientific and advancement is such an important piece of the scientific process. And I think we've reached a point in consciousness studies where it's very difficult to move forward. And usually that's a sign that we need to start shaking up our intuition. So, throughout history, the huge breakthroughs, the things that have really shifted our view of the universe and our place in the universe and all of that, those almost always, if not always, require that we, at the very least, shift our intuitions, update our intuitions, but many of them we just have to let go of intuitions that are feeding us false information about the way the world works.
Well, the weirdest thing here is that here we're looking at our own mind.
Yeah.
So you have to let go of your intuitions about your own intuitions.
Yeah, right. Exactly. It's very meta and makes it hard. And it's part of the reason why doing interviews for me feels so difficult, aside from the fact that I just have social anxiety in general.
Well, it's good because I took mushrooms just before we started.
So we're in
this journey together. Let's go. So where do we take a step backwards?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, this leads into the point I was going to make, but what I was going to say is, I mean, also just for me, I feel like I'm not as good at speaking as I am at writing, that I'm clear in my writing. And because these topics are so difficult to get our minds around, it's hard to kind of get to any real conclusion in real time. It's actually how I started writing my book, was just writing for myself. I decided that I needed to spend some time writing down all of my thoughts in order to get clear about how I think about them.
So you write down a sentence and you think. in the silence and the quiet
Paragraphs.
paragraphs, and
Yeah.
you just
And then I see if that makes sense. And then I check it with my intuitions, which is really the scientific process. And I really, in many ways, I feel like I'm a physicist at heart. All of my inquiry, all of my career, everything I'm interested in, actually going back to being a child, is just deep curiosity about how the world works, what this place is, what it's made of, how we got here. Just being amazed at the fact that I'm having an experience over here and you're having one over there, and we're in this moment of time. And, what does that all mean? My interest in consciousness really came out of originally an interest in physics. And I guess that the two were always side by side, and I didn't really connect them until I was older. But I've always been really interested in just understanding the nature of reality before I even had language to
yeah.
describe it.
You talked about sort of laying down and looking up at the stars and
Yeah,
sort of trying to let go of the intuition that there's a ground below us,
yeah,
which
yeah.
is a really interesting exercise. And there's many exercises of this sort you can do, but
Yes.
that's a really good one.
Well, and I think, scientists and children who will become scientists or just kind of scientists at heart really enjoy that feeling of breaking through their intuitions. And I remember the first time it happened, actually, I was playing with marbles. And, marbles have all these different shapes. Each one is unique, and it looks like there's liquid inside them. And I remember asking my father how they got the liquid inside the glass ball. And he said, actually, it's solid all the way through. It's all glass. And I had such a hard time imagining. It just didn't seem right to me. I was very young but he's a complicated person, but he was wonderful in this way, in that he would kind of entertain my curiosity. And so he said, let's open them up. And he got a towel, and we put the marbles on the towel, and got a hammer, and he smashed them all. And lo and behold, it was all glass. And I remember it's like the first time I had that feeling of realizing, wow, the truth was so different from what I expected. And I like that feeling. And of course, we need to be able to do that to understand that the earth is flat, to understand the germ theory of disease, to understand long processes in nature like evolution. I mean, we just can never really intuit that we share genes with ants.
Did you just say the earth is flat? You mean the earth is not flat?
Did I say that?
Yeah, this is great. But I actually like to think
Exactly. See,
about.
this is why I need to write and not speak.
Well, I actually really like conspiracy theories and so on. I really
Yeah.
like flat Earth people that believe the Earth is flat, or
Yeah.
not believe but argue for the Earth is flat.
Well, it's interesting because you can see, I mean, the intuition is so strong. I just said it.
The thing I love about folks who argue for flat Earth is they are thinking deeply. They're questioning actually what has now become intuition. Are it's become the mainstream narrative that the Earth is round, where people actually don't, don't think actually how crazy it is that the Earth is round.
Right.
We're in a ball.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you're doing. You're looking out into space. It's really humbling because I think the basic intuition when you're walking around the ground, there's a underlying belief that Earth is the center of the universe. There's a kind of feeling like this is the only world that exists. And you kind of know that there's a huge universe out there, but you don't really load that information in.
Right.
And I think flat earthers are really contending with those big ideas.
Yeah. No, and I think, I mean, the truth is that when those observations were first made, when the celestial observations were made that revealed this fact to us, I can't remember how long it took, but I think it was close to 100 years before it was actually accepted as common knowledge that we're no longer the center of the universe. Or, of course, we never were. But and that's true almost every time we have a breakthrough like that challenges our intuitions. There's usually a period of time where we have to, and this is an important part of the process because often our intuitions give us good information. And so when the science when our scientific observations go against our intuitions, it's important for us to let that in and to see, which side is going to win. And once it's clear that the evidence is winning, then there's this period of time where we have to grapple with our intuitions and shift the way we frame our worldview and go through that process.
But free will
Free will is a hard one.
is a hard one.
So here we are, still, in consciousness studies, pretty stuck, at least in terms of the neuroscience. And so that's why I started thinking more deeply about that. That's why a lot of scientists right now are actually interested in studying consciousness, where it was very taboo before. And so we're at this really interesting turning point, and it's wonderful. But it will require that we shake up our intuitions a bit and reframe some things and look at what the neuroscience is telling us. And there are a lot of questions. We have more questions than answers. But I think it's time. I think if we're going to make progress in consciousness studies, we need to start really looking at the illusions and false intuitions that are getting in our way.
Do you think studying the brain can give us clues about free will, like some of these
Oh, yeah,
questions?
absolutely. I think it already has. And I think many facts that have come out of neuroscience are still barely seeping into the culture. I mean, I think this is going to be a long process. So part of my work is really just looking at areas where we already know some of our intuitions are wrong and starting to accept them and starting to let them in and starting to ask questions about, well, what does this mean then about the nature of consciousness?
Let's try to actually get into this question of free will and conscious will. I have my intuitions here are, I mean, I'm a human being.
Yeah.
It's really, I mean, I approach it from two aspects. From one is a human being, and two from a robotics perspective.
Right.
And I wonder how big the gap between the two is. And that's a useful, from an engineering perspective, is another perspective that's useful and helpful to take on this. It's like, are we really so different, you and I, the robot and the human? You'd like to believe so, but you don't exactly see where the difference is.
Research into AI and just the fact that it's entered our consciousness at the level of stories and film and all of these questions that it's raising is facing us with that. It's almost like the zombie experiment is coming to life for us. We're more and more looking at human-like systems and wondering, is there an experience in there, and how can we figure that out? When you were talking about your experience of looking at robots, it reminds me of how I, for many years, have been looking at plants. Because the plant behavior, and actually, this is the example. Maybe we'll just try it out. It may not work. This is an example I was thinking of recently because I was reading back on the work of Mark Jaffe, who did this research with pea tendrils. I'm sure he did many other plant studies, but this is the one I was reading about. And I'm hoping this analogy, I'll just set it up. I'm hoping that this analogy will be something that we can keep coming back to as we move forward, because as we shake up our intuitions and get confused, and then we come back to our intuitions and say, no, that just can't be. I think this analogy might be helpful. But
what kind of plant was he working on?
Pea tendrils. So a pea plant has these tendrils. You can picture them. They coil. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what year this research was done. I'm guessing in the 80s, but
But pea tendrils have been around long before that.
Yes, of course. and the research may have happened long before the 80s.
In fact, they might be doing the research on the humans, but that's another story.
Yeah, right. Pea tendrils, as a system, generally, there are a few more things they can do, but generally they can behave in two ways. They can grow in a straight line slowly, or they can grow in this coil form more quickly. And what happens is when they are growing in a straight manner and they encounter a branch or a pole or something else that it can wrap itself around to gain more stability, when it senses a branch there, that gives it the cue to start growing at a more rapid pace and to start coiling instead of growing straight. So it has these two behaviors. As a system, it's capable of growing straight and it's capable of coiling. One interesting thing, actually, I'll just add this, it's not totally relevant, but one interesting thing is Mark Jaffe's work. So he cut a pea tendril. He was curious to see if it could do this on its own, separate from the rest of the plant. So he cut a pea tendril off the plant If you keep it in a moist, warm environment, it will continue to behave in these ways. So it will continue to coil. If he noticed that if he touched one end of it, if he rubbed one side of it, that gave it enough of a cue that it would start to coil. And then he noticed that it needed light to perform this action. So in the dark, when he rubbed the edge of the tendril, it did not coil. In the light, it would. And then he recognized this further fact, which was that the P tendril that he rubbed in the dark, that was still straight, if he brought it out into the light, and this could be hours later, it would start to coil. It has a primitive form of memory where it's has the sensation and then it holds on to that information. And as soon as there's light, it acts on that information.
But also in a kind of distributed intelligence, because you can separate it from the main from the main part.
Right.
Like if you chop off a human arm, it's not gonna keep growing.
Even if you keep it in a moist, warm environment, it's not going to reach out for the cup of coffee when you come in with Starbucks.
Maybe in the correct environment. Maybe we just haven't found the environment. But anyway, that's pretty amazing.
So that's a separate fact. But anyway, so if you just use the analogy of a P tendril, and if you imagine, which is something I like to do a lot, if you imagine this plant has some kind of conscious experience, of course, it doesn't have complex thought. It doesn't have anything like a human experience. But if it were possible for a plant to have some felt experience, you can imagine that when it comes into contact with a branch and starts to coil, that feeling could be one of deciding to do that, or that it feels good to do that, or kind of wanting. I mean, that's too complex. That's anthropomorphizing, but there's a way in which you could imagine this P tendril under those circumstances suddenly wants to start coiling.
So you're saying you try to meditate on what it's like to be a P tendril, a plant. Like that's what's required here. It's like you have to empathize with a plant or with another organism that's not human.
Yeah, and you don't actually need that for this analogy the larger analogy that I'm getting at, but I think that's an interesting piece to keep in mind, that you could imagine that in nature, if there's a conscious experience associated with a P tendril, that at that moment, what that feels like is a want to start moving in a different way.
Right. So you want to imagine that without anthropomorphizing, so without projecting the human experience, but rather sort of humbling yourself that we're just another plant with more complexity.
Yes.
Like trying to see where...
Exactly. So that's where I'm going with this.
Sure.
So, and when you start making that connection, you can see where there are a few points at which there's room for an illusion to come in for our own feelings of will. So when we move from a P tendril to human decision-making, obviously, human decision-making, human brains are many, many, many times more complex than whatever is going on in a P tendril. I mean, the brain is actually the most complex thing we know of in the universe thus far. So there is the genes that help develop the brain into any particular brain into what it is. There are all the inputs. There are countless factors that we could never, I mean, it may as well be an infinite number of factors. And then in that particular moment, whatever the inputs are to a brain, the brain is capable of almost an infinite number of outputs, right? So if I walked in here this morning and you said, would you like water or tea? And that's, simple decision for me to make.
Passive aggressive way of telling me I should have offered you some tea. But yes,
funny.
Go on.
No, I wanted water.
Okay. All right.
I actually asked for water.
All right, great.
And you didn't have any free will anyway, so it doesn't matter. I don't hold you responsible for any of it.
Exactly. I was just running an algorithm.
So
deterministically.
You give me this decision, right, to make water or tea. Go back to the P tendril for a second. A P tendril is capable of growing in a straight line slowly or in a coil quickly. My brain is capable of all kinds of responses to that question. Even though you've given me, two options, you could offer me water or tea, and I could just run out of the room screaming if I wanted to. Right?
Happens to me all the time on dates.
Like, never mind, I don't want to do this.
Yes.
The fact that the brain is capable, that there's so many inputs, and then the brain is capable of so many outputs as a system, what it's hard for us to get our minds around is that it may not be capable of any behavior in every moment in time. So as a system, it's capable of doing all kinds of things. And the point I'm making is that if we could see all of the factors leading up to the moment where I chose water or where I ran screaming from the room, we could, in fact, see that there was no other behavior I was going to or could have exhibited in that moment. In the same way that when the pea tendril hits the branch, it starts coiling.
There's a parallel which is very interesting in robotics with fish and water. So you could see they've experiments with like dead fish and they keep swimming. So the fish is capable of all kinds of complicated movements as a system. But in any one moment, the river, the full complexity of the river defines the actual movement of the fish. And the most efficient.
Well, and I should also, I mean, this brings up another point, which is that there is a difference between voluntary and involuntary behavior. So, of course, we have reflexes, and it is there's different brain processing in action when I make a decision about water or tea than there is, if my behavior is forced from the outside, or if I have a brain tumor that's causing me to make certain decisions or feel certain feelings. And so the point is that at bottom, it's all brain processing and behavior. But the reason why certain actions feel willed, there's a good reason why it feels that way. And it's to distinguish our own self-generated behavior based on thinking and possibly weighing the different results of different things. I already had caffeine today. I don't want more. There are all these processes, things that we can point to and things that we can't, things I'm affected by at a subconscious level. And that is very different from an unwilled action or a reflex or something like that. And so some people, I can imagine, I haven't used the pea tendril example, but I can imagine they wouldn't like that because the pea tendril sounds more to them like a reflex, and that doesn't address the question of a much more complex decision-making process. But I think at bottom, that is what it is. And that's really where the illusion of free will and the illusion of self, which I think they're kind of two sides of the same coin, come from. So even when we intellectually understand that everything we're feeling, everything we're doing is based on our brain processing and brain behavior. If you're a physicalist, you've bought into that. Even when you intellectually understand that, and I include myself in this, we still have this feeling that there's something that stands outside of the brain processing that can intervene. And that's the illusion. I was tweeting with someone recently, which I almost never do, but we're working in the TED documentary that I'm making right now. We're working on the episode on free will. So I was allowing myself to go back and forth in a way that I don't usually on Twitter.
Like arguing?
About free will. It was a friendly debate. I'm going to go into the reasons why I'm not crazy about Twitter, but let's leave that for another time. I mean, talk about how hard it is to have this conversation when we have as many hours as we like, trying to do it in sound bites over Twitter.
See, I like how you made the decision now not to talk about Twitter. It's
well, my brain,
road less traveled.
That was one of the things I said to this person was, because someone chimed in and said, "You said I. What do you mean by I?" And so actually, that's another point I could make, which is, first, my response to that was, well, people tend to get creeped out when I say the system that is my brain and body that we call Annaka recommends.
Why do they get freaked out? Oh, you mean like in your personal life? Oh,
instead of like never saying I, so always.
Well, you're just being.
But I always refer to you as the brain and body we call Lex.
Yes. Well, I don't know. That's kind of charming in a way. Alleged brain.
So I and you are very useful shorthand, even though at some level they're illusions. They're very useful shorthand for the system of my brain, really, and my body, the whole system. That I is useful for that, but the illusion is when we feel like there's something outside of that system that can intervene, that is free, that's somehow free from the physical world. I can have the thought, I really am not crazy about having intellectual back and forth on Twitter, and then feel like I decide to not follow that thought, right? And the feeling, that's the feeling where the illusion comes in, because it really feels as if, sure, my brain had that original thought, and then I came in and made a different decision.
Yeah.
But of course, the truth is, it was just further brain processing that got me to decide not to go down that path.
How much is that feeling of conscious will is culturally constructed
Mm,
shorthand? So like I and you is a you could say a culturally constructed shorthand. How much of that affects how we think? So our parents say I and you, and then we start to believe in I and you. And is that, or are we, is that fundamental to the human brain machine
yeah.
that we,
I think it goes very deep. I think it's fundamental, and I think it probably, some form of feeling like a self goes as deep as cats and dogs, and it's possible. I mean, if consciousness does go down to the level of cells, or however far down you want to take it, worms, or I think any system that's navigating itself, that kind of has boundaries and is navigating itself in the world. Um, my guess is that it's an intrinsic part of. That's why I imagined that the P tendril would have this feeling. And so, we use the word I. I think you're right, first of all, that the way we talk about things affects our intuitions about them and how we feel about them. And so there are other cultures who are more open to breaking through these illusions than others, for sure, just because of their belief sets, the way they talk. I mean, I'm sure I'm not a linguist, and I don't even speak a second language, so I can't speak to it. But if there were a language um, that framed who we are differently in everyday language, I mean, in our everyday communication, I would think that would have an effect.
yeah, language does affect things. I mean, just knowing Russian and the history of the Soviet Union in the 20th century. Obviously, it lived under communism for a long time. So your conception of individualism is different, and that reflects itself in the
Absolutely.
language.
Yeah.
You could probably have this similar kind of thing within the language in terms of how we talk about I and we and so on.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's like certain countries or maybe even villages with certain dialects that like let go of the individualism that's inherent.
Yeah, I mean,
in I.
there must be a range, but I do think that it's pretty deep,
Yeah.
and I think um, there's also a difference between the autobiographical me and then this more fundamental me that we're talking about, where that I'm pointing to as the illusion. So, in my book, I talk about if someone wakes up with amnesia, if they have brain injury and suddenly have amnesia and can't remember anything about their lives, can't remember their name, don't recognize people they're related to, um, they would have lost their autobiographical self, but they would still feel like an I. They would still have that basic sense of, I'm a person. I mean, they'd be speaking that way. I don't remember my name. I don't know where I live. It goes very deep, this feeling that I am a single entity that is somehow not completely reliant upon the cause and effect of the physical world.
Can I ask you a pothead question?
Yeah.
Would you would you rather lose all your memories
Hmm.
or not be able to make new ones? If you had to, now I'm asking you as a human,
Yeah.
in terms of happiness and preference.
Oh, I can't answer that.
You like both. You like both features of the organism that you embody.
Well, one is intellectual and one is psychological, really. I mean,
Which one?
I would have to choose the memories only because, I mean, the memories of the past,
Yeah.
only because I have children and a family, and it wouldn't just be affecting me, it would be affecting them. It would just be too horrible.
No, but you would make new ones, right?
If I lost my memory of the
Oh, you
13
think
years of my
would you
daughter's life,
you think you would lose This is a dark question.
Oh, wait, wasn't that the question? Maybe I misunderstood.
No. You understood it perfectly, but
Yeah.
you don't. Oh, sorry for the dark question, but the people you love in your life, if you lost all your memory of everything, do you think you would still love them? Like you show up, you don't know.
I don't know.
It's a roll of the dice.
I mean, it would not in the way that I do.
Right. So,
No.
some deep aspect of love is the history you have together.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and this gets to an interesting point, actually, which I think a lot about, which is memory. And we won't go into this yet, but I'll just plant a flag here
I
that
love the song.
memory is, yeah, memory is obviously related to time, and time is something that I'm fascinated with. And for this project I'm working on now, I've mostly been speaking to physicists who are interested in consciousness. And it's partly because of this link between memory and time and, all of these new fascinating theories and thoughts around the different interpretations of quantum mechanics, and looking at, the thing that I've always been looking for is really the fundamental nature of reality, and why my questions about consciousness lead me to wonder if consciousness is a more fundamental aspect of the universe than we previously thought, and certainly I previously thought. And so memory is tied to so many things. I mean, even basic functions in nature. Actually, so the P tendril, as I mentioned, memory comes into play there, and that's so fascinating. And there is no sense of self without memory, even if you're starting from scratch, as you said, with amnesia. If you truly couldn't lay down any new memories, I think then that sense of self would begin to disintegrate, because the sense of self is one of a concrete entity through time. And if if you really were stuck in the present moment eternally, you'd basically be meditating. And in meditation, this is a very common experience, is losing that sense of self, that sense of free will, that those illusions more easily drop away in meditation. And I would say for most people who meditate long enough, they do drop away. And there's actually an explanation at the level of the brain as well. The default mode network is circuitry in the brain that neuroscientists don't completely understand, but know is largely responsible for this feeling of being a self. And when that circuit gets quieted down, which it does in meditation and also does with the use of psychedelic drugs, and there are other ways to quiet down the default mode network, people have this experience of losing this illusion of being a self. They no longer feel that they're a self in the way that they usually do.
So there's the autobiographical self is connected to the sense of self through
absolutely.
through the memory.
Sure.
And then you're thinking that
But
the solution to that lies in physics, not just neuroscience. Like ultimately consciousness and the experience, the conscious will is a question of physics.
I may have said something misleading because I was connecting too many dots.
Half the things I say are misleading. Let us mislead each other.
I got excited when memory came up because I love talking about time.
So you mentioned a project you're working on a couple of times. What's that about? I think you said TED is involved. You're interviewing a bunch of people. What's going on?
Yeah.
What's the topic?
So I'm working on an audio documentary about consciousness, and it picks up where my book left off. So all of the questions that were still lingering for me, and research that I still wanted to do, I just started conducting. So I've done about 30 interviews so far, and it's not totally clear what the end result will be. I'm currently collaborating with TED, and I'm having a lot of fun creating a pilot with them. And so we'll see where it goes. But the idea is that it's a narrated documentary.
And it's like a series.
A series. It'll be a 10-part series.
It's an unclear. Oh, you already know the number of parts.
Sorry, in my mind, it's a 10-part series. It may end up being 8 or 11 or 12. I don't know why.
Listen, I am very comforted by the number 0 and 1 as well.
About 10.
I like the confidence of 10. So, and you're not sure what the title, like, well, not the title, but the topic, will there be consciousness or something bigger or something smaller or
Yeah, I
something
mean, it's
different?
so at the end of my book, I kind of get to the place where I've convinced myself, at least, that this question about whether consciousness is fundamental is a legitimate one. And then I just start spending a lot of time thinking about what that would mean, if it's even possible to study scientifically. So I mostly talk to physicists, actually, because I really think ultimately this is a question for physics. If consciousness is fundamental, I think it needs to be strongly informed by neuroscience, but it's if it's part of the fabric of reality, it is a question for a physicist. So I speak to different physicists about different interpretations of quantum mechanics, so getting at the fundamentals. So
So Sean
string
Carroll,
theory and
is
many
that
worlds. I spoke to Sean Carroll. I had a great conversation with Sean Carroll. He's so generous because he clearly doesn't agree with me about many things. But he has a curious mind and he's willing to have these conversations. And I was really interested in understanding many worlds better and if consciousness is fundamental, what the implications are. So that was where I started, actually, was with many worlds. And then we had conversations about string theory and the holographic principle. I spoke to Lee Smolin and Brian Greene and Jana Levin and Carlo Rovelli, actually. Have you had Carlo on?
no, no.
Okay, he's great also and fun to talk to because he's
Great
just
accent.
endlessly curious. Yeah,
And you're doing audio.
it's all audio. Yeah, but it's in the format of a documentary. So I'm narrating it and kind of telling the story of what questions came up for me, what I was interested in exploring, and then, why I talk to each person I talk to.
By the way, I highly recommend Sean Carroll's Mindscape podcast. I think it's called.
Yeah.
It's amazing. One of my
Yeah,
favorite things. Well, when he interviews physicists, it's great. But
Mm.
any topic, his aim is. But one of my favorite things is how frustrated he gets with panpsychism. But he's still like, it's like a fly
No.
towards the light.
Yeah.
For some reason, he can't like make sense
Yeah.
of it, but like he still struggles with it. And I think
He's
that's
interested.
that's the sign of a good scientist, really
Absolutely.
struggling with these ideas.
I totally agree. And yes, that's what I appreciate in him and many scientists like that.
Who has the craziest, most radical ideas who you talk with currently? So you can go either direction. You can go like panpsychism, consciousness permeates everything.
Yeah.
I don't know how far you can go down that direction, or you could say that what would be the other direction that
Well, there isn't real. The problem is they're all crazy.
they're all crazy.
Each one is
All of
crazier
us are
than the next.
crazy.
And my own thoughts now, I have to be very careful about the words I choose because I mean it's just like talking about the different interpretations of quantum mechanics. It's once you get deep enough, it's so counterintuitive and it's so beyond anything we understand that they all sound crazy. Many worlds sounds crazy. String theory. I mean, these are things we just cannot get our minds around, really. And so that's the realm I love to live in and love to explore in. And the realm that, to my surprise, my interest in consciousness has taken me back to.
Can I ask you a question on that?
Yeah.
Just a side tangent. How do you prevent when you're imagining yourself to be a pea tendril? How do you prevent from going crazy? I mean, this is kind of the
Oh.
Nietzsche question of like,
Mm.
you have to be very careful thinking outside the norms of
Mhm.
society because you might fall off. Like mentally, you're so connected as a human to the collective intelligence
Yeah.
that in order to question intuitions, you have to step outside of it for a brief moment.
Mm.
How do you prevent yourself from going crazy?
I think I used to think that was a concern.
And then you
I've
became
learned
crazy.
so much about the brain. No, and
Oh, I see.
I've had experiences of deep depression and I've struggled with anxiety my whole life. I think in order to be a good scientist and in order to be a truthfully, let's say, to allow yourself to be curious and honest in your curiosity, I think it's inevitable that lots of ideas and theories and hypotheses will just sound crazy And that is always how we've advanced science. And maybe, 9 out of 10 ideas are crazy, and crazy meaning they're actually not correct. But it's as I said, all of the big scientific breakthroughs, all of the truths we've uncovered that are the earth-shattering truths that we uncover, they really do sound crazy at first. So I don't think one necessarily leads to a type of mental illness. I see mental illness in a very different category. And I think some people are more susceptible to being destabilized by this type of thinking. And that might be a legitimate concern for some people, that kind of being grounded in everyday life is important. For my psychological health, the more time I spend thinking about the bigger picture and outside of everyday life, the more happy I am, the more expansive I feel. It feels nourishing to me. It feels like it makes me more sane, not less. So,
Well, that's a happiness, but in terms of your ability to see the truth, that you can be happy and
I
completely.
guess I don't see mental illness necessarily being linked to truth or not truth.
So we were talking about minimizing mental illness, but also truth is a different dimension. So you can go crazy in both directions. You can, you could be extremely happy, and they are flat earthers. You can believe the earth is flat,
right?
Because they're actually, I'm sure there's good books on this, but it's somehow really comforting. It's fun and comforting to believe you figured out the thing that everybody else hasn't figured out.
I think that's what conspiracy theories always provide people.
Why is it so fun? Link. It's so fun. It's except when it's dangerous. Yeah. But even then, it's probably fun. But then you shouldn't do it because it's unethical. Anyway,
that's not true. I'm not a fan of following.
Well, that makes one of us. No, I don't know. There is probably a fascinating story to why conspiracy theories are so compelling to us human beings, as deeper than just fun internet stuff.
I'm very interested in why they're so compelling to some people and not others. I feel like there must be some difference that at some point we'll be able to discover.
And
because some people are just not susceptible to them, and some people are.
And I wonder
really
what's the correlation
drawn to them.
Because I feel like the kind of thinking that allows for you to be open to conspiracy theories is also the kind of thinking that leads to brilliant breakthroughs in science. Sort of willingness to go to crazy land.
That's
something that seems like crazy land.
I see it the opposite way.
Really?
Yeah.
So you don't see the connection between thinking the Earth is flat and coming up with special
thinking
relativity?
The Earth is flat is following your intuitions and not being open to counterintuitive ideas. It's a very closed way of viewing things. Saying it's not the way you feel. There's information that tells us there's something else going on, and that type of person will say, no, it's the way it feels to me.
No. But wait a minute. There's a mainstream narrative of science that says the Earth is round,
right?
And I think a flat earther I admire the very first step of a flat earther. I don't admire the full journey, but the first step is.
I think if you're open to evidence, then the evidence clearly takes you in one direction.
Right, but you have to ask the question. You have to ask. To me, this is like first principles thinking.
Yeah.
The Earth looks flat, so I'm going to look around here, and I like. How crazy is it that the Earth is round and there's a thing called gravity that operates between objects that's related to the mass of the object?
Right.
That's crazy.
Yes. The truth is often crazier than what the situation feels to be.
A good step is to question what everyone is saying, and then you
I know what you mean, to be skeptical about the authority.
Yeah,
factor.
But I think that the authority not in some kind of weird current where everyone questions institutions, but more like the authority of the senior scientists the junior scientists coming up. Wait a minute. Why have we been doing things this way? And that first step, I feel like that rebelliousness or that open mindedness or maybe like resistance to, or maybe curiosity that is not affected by whatever the mainstream science says of today.
Yes, I feel like mainstream science has never been mainstream, and it's always a struggle for science to become mainstream. It's part of the reason why I started doing the work I did, actually helping scientists make their work more accessible, is that it's usually not.
Yeah.
It's usually not.
Here's advice for scientists: be more interesting, and much more important, be less arrogant. So arrogance, there's very little money in science, and so everyone is fighting for that money, and they become more and more arrogant and siloed. I don't know why.
I will
They don't need
say
to.
that the scientists I know, and
Mhm.
some of them are very well-known, very famous scientists, are the least arrogant people I've ever met. That scientists in general, their personalities are more open, more humble, more likely to say they just don't know.
Mhm.
Because I've been involved a lot in the science writing and how the media portrays. So, one of the scientific community's greatest frustration is how their work gets presented in the media. And a lot of the time, that is I would say that's the main frustration is there's some new breakthrough, there's something, and the scientists will be saying, we're not sure. It's going to take 5 years. And no one likes to write a story about something that may or may not be true. They think it's true. They're going to take 5 years testing it. And so the headline will be neuroscientists discovered, they want the sensational. And so I think the public often gets the false impression
Yes.
that the scientists are arrogant. And I really don't find that to be the case. And I've worked with all kinds of people, artists, and my life path has taken a strange.
You've met some incredible people. You work with some incredible people. So let's the crazy topic of free will. I mean, we have to linger on
Okay.
this because I can't.
Okay.
So the plant. All right, can you try to steel man the case that there's something really special about humans? That there is a fundamental difference between us and the P tendril. Humans are clearly very special in the evolution of organisms on Earth.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Could that have been the magic leap? Could consciousness been like the invention of the eukaryotic cell or something like this?
Well, then, so I have to get clear on what you're asking. So are you coming from a place of wondering if we are the only conscious mammals?
Yes.
Do you really think that's a question?
Can you make a case for it?
Do you really think that's a question? Take one step back. We look out at the universe. At this point in our scientific understanding, we know that essentially we're all made of the same ingredients, right? They're atoms in the universe doing their thing. They find themselves in different configurations based on the laws of physics. And then the question is, if we look out at all of the configurations of atoms in the universe and ask, which of these entail conscious experiences? Which of these have a felt experience of being the matter they are? And there are really only two, broadly speaking, there are really only two assumptions to make here. And the first one is the one that science has taken and that I have for most of my career as well, and that in many ways makes the most sense, which is electrons aren't conscious, tables aren't there's no felt experience there, but at a certain point in complex processing, that processing entails an experience of being that processing. Now that's just a fascinating fact all on its own, and I love to spend time thinking about that. But so the question is, does consciousness arise at some point? Are some of these collections of atoms conscious? Or are all of them? Because we know the answer isn't none. I know that I'm at least having a conscious experience. I know that conscious experiences exist in the universe. And so the answer isn't none. So the answer has to be all or some. And this is a starting assumption that you're really kind of forced to make, and that it's all or some.
All or some
I
or
would
one?
say one is some also. We either need an explanation for why there's non-conscious matter in the universe, and then something happens for consciousness to come
Yes.
into being, or it's part of the fundamental nature of reality.
It's also, if consciousness is a fundamental property of reality, it could also choose to not reveal itself until a certain complexity of organism.
I'm not sure what that means.
I'm not sure what that means either.
Okay.
Like the flame of consciousness does not start burning until a certain complexity of organisms is able to
So I
reveal
don't
it.
think we can look at consciousness that way. I don't think, I mean, many people like to try to make that argument that it's a spectrum. Why do we have to say all or nothing? Maybe.
Yeah.
And I agree that I actually think it is a spectrum, but it's a spectrum of content, not of consciousness itself. So, if a worm has some level of conscious experience, it is extremely minimal, something we could never imagine having the complex experience you and I have. Maybe some felt sensation of pressure or heat or something super basic, right? So there's this range, or even if you just think of an infant, like the moment an infant becomes conscious, there's a very, very minimal experience of inputs of sound and light and whatever it is. And so there's a spectrum of content. There's a spectrum of how much a system is consciously experiencing, but there's a moment at which you get on the spectrum. And I truly believe that that piece of it is binary. So if there's no conscious experience, there is no consciousness. You can't say consciousness is there, it just hasn't lit its flame yet. If consciousness is there, there's an experience there by definition. It has to arise at some point, or it
Yes.
has to always be there.
Is it possible to make the case that it arising happens first, for the first time ever, with Homo sapiens?
I think that is extremely unlikely. What I think is more possible, based on what we understand about the brain, is that it arises in brains or nervous systems. And so then we're talking about flies and bees and all kinds of things that kind of fall out of our intuitions for whether they could be conscious or not. But I think, especially once you talk about more complex brains with many, many more neurons, when you're talking about cats and dogs and dolphins, it's very hard to see how there would be a difference between humans and other mammals in terms of consciousness.
Was there a difference in terms of intelligence between humans
Sure.
and other mammals?
Sure.
No, but like a fundamental leap in intelligence.
It's hard to say definitively. I mean, it depends on, how you define intelligence and all kinds of things. But obviously, humans are unique and capable of all kinds of things that no other mammals are capable of. And there are important differences. And I don't think you need any magical intervention of something outside of the physical world to explain it. And the way I think about consciousness, I actually think it's part of the reason we're mistaken about consciousness is because we are special in the ways that we're special.